On the line is Ben Rhodes. Ben, where are you? You're at Colgate?
I'm at Colgate University, Tommy.
What town is that?
It's in Hamilton, New York, a quaint, beautiful 19th century town in upstate New York.
Awesome. Well, that's great. I hope you're talking to students and getting them pumped up about foreign policy. So it's been obviously a brutal week in the wake of the New Zealand shooting. We've been talking a lot about right-wing extremist groups. So what that made me think of was back in the White House days. So before you started attending the PDB, the President's Daily Intelligence Briefing with Obama in the Oval Office, they would bring you the book and then a briefer would brief it to you so you could learn about that day's intelligence. The guy you had briefing you for a while, who I will not name, was actually, I believe, an expert in white supremacist groups, right? And he'd actually, I think, infiltrated one. Was he telling you things about the rise of these right-wing extremist groups then that sort of foretold the events we're seeing now?
Yeah, he was. And Tommy, you'll remember, I found this guy so interesting that I used to talk to you about this. He'd come in to brief me, and usually the PDB would be filled with, reports of terrorist plots from Al-Qaeda and other groups overseas. But this guy had worked to kind of help penetrate and understand the white supremacist movement in the United States. And this is back in 2009, 2010. Mm-hmm. And his message to me consistently was always, we got to be worrying more about these guys. That if you look at the actual threats of violence in the United States, there was a growing threat that he saw emanating from white supremacists, that some of the legacy organizations of, like the Ku Klux Klan, for instance, and other, white separatist movements were gaining new momentum because of the combination of social media and some of the, antagonism towards a black president in the United States. Mm-hmm. And you might remember, Tommy, early in the Obama years, there was a shooting at the Holocaust Museum,
right,
from a white supremacist who tragically shot a guard at the Holocaust Museum. And they found in his, among his media, like a list of people that he wanted to target.
Yep.
And it eerily foreshadowed a lot of the, plots that we've seen disrupted in the last year or two. We did try to sound the alarm on this. And consistently, for instance, to the Obama administration, we would refer to violent extremism generally as a threat because we thought it had to encompass both ISIS and Al-Qaeda, but also white supremacists. And this is something that we were kind of relentlessly mocked for not naming the enemy as radical Islam.
Yeah.
And it was kind of ironic to see Trump refusing to label the enemy of white supremacists. And it goes to show, why these labels are important. I mean, I don't think anyone would want us to be referring to kind of radical white terrorism. Casting a broad brush on people is not the way to go after them. It's to focus on them and understand them and pull the threads on them.
Yeah. So, when you think about how one would disrupt, break up, deal with these white supremacist groups, is it the same tools that you would use with Al-Qaeda? I mean, I imagine there'd be signals intelligence collection to figure out what they're doing. There would be a law enforcement component, efforts to penetrate the organizations with undercover agents. And then, with dealing with groups that might, let me say this, and one critical component of dealing with, potentially radicalized young people is a community engagement element that helps you identify at-risk individuals before it's too late by getting a tip from their friend, their sister, their, whatever it might be, because we won't necessarily be able to hear them before it's too late, right? Is the same toolkit apply to white supremacist groups?
Yes. I mean, it's a little different if you're dealing with American citizens, obviously.
Yeah, good point.
There's a higher bar than in dealing with a terrorist organization based overseas.
And particularly for intelligence collection, right? I mean, we can't spy on
exactly
an individual, an American, yeah.
But, if we see this as a national security threat, which I think we should, I mean, just think of it this way. If you compare the numbers of Americans killed by white supremacists versus the number of Americans killed by terrorists who represent an Islamic ideology of some sort or another. By far, the greater threat over the last several years has been from white supremacist terrorism. And, if you want to deal with a national security threat, there are multi dimensions to that. If there are people who have already crossed the line into plotting acts of violence, then you can aggressively pursue them and try to penetrate their organizations and try to detain their leaders who are plotting and to try to understand more about them. And you would want to deploy those law enforcement resources as aggressively as you would against any other terrorist organization. And that is a matter of resourcing and prioritization.
Yeah.
And then secondly, yes, the threat of radicalization, people who've studied this find that it's quite similar. The same pattern that could lead a young Muslim to be radicalized to the ideology of ISIS, maybe finding online content at first, then maybe being contacted by someone who has been radicalized in his community, and then plotting on his own or with a small group some act of violence. Well, that's the same thing that happens among these white supremacist groups. People consuming poisonous online content, people joining vitriolic, hate-filled online networks, then maybe meeting a like-minded person and switching a gear to wanting to actually carry out an act of violence. And you do need engagement inside of these communities to prevent that process of radicalization. But the uncomfortable truth is that we need to treat this as a threat to our national security, and that means devoting resources to understanding the problem and disrupting people who want to commit acts of violence and trying to stem the rising tide of radicalization, which is harder when the President of the United States is one of the sources of that radicalization. I mean, he may not like people saying it, but there's a common thread among a number of these people who've been detained here, and even among the New Zealand shooter, that they are identifying in Trump someone who they're taking some degree of inspiration from, and that's that's a reality that's just staring us in the face.
Yeah, and I think the debate is over whether these xenophobic nationalist right-wing parties in the rhetoric they use are actually driving people to be more violent. But what's frightening is that these nationalist parties are ascendant all across Europe. I mean, Italy, Austria, Germany, Sweden, the list goes on and on that members of these parties are winning more and more seats. What role do you think the U.S. should play in trying to deal with these parties or mitigate the impact they could have in politics in Europe?
Well, again, you're absolutely right that this is a transnational threat. And again, we can learn from the threat of al-Qaeda and ISIS and the way in which that ideology with social media and other mechanisms spread across borders. We're seeing the same pattern here of social networks and propaganda and disinformation and common themes and grievances spreading among disaffected white people across borders. Mm-hmm. So in a strange way, we should be somewhat familiar with how this cancer is spreading because we've seen it spread in other communities. Yeah. I think to begin with, there has to be, from the political leadership of countries in the West, just a complete rejection of this ideology. And unfortunately, we don't have that yet. Yeah. So the first part of this is, frankly, going to have to involve kind of winning elections and beating back this ideology at the ballot box. I think beyond that, there really does need to be a reckoning with how social media platforms are used by these groups. And here again, we did this, Tommy, in the Obama administration. We had years of dialogue with Silicon Valley about ISIS content. Mm-hmm. And, we got to a point where the government wasn't directing them to do anything, but through sharing of information and education, they began to take down certain verified ISIS content that was calling upon people to commit acts of violence. And I think it just raises the question, why can you take down that content if it's from an ISIS member, and why not apply the same standard to other groups who are propagating hateful ideologies that are calling upon people to commit acts of violence? I mean, either you want these platforms that have such awesome reach to not be a forum that motivate people to kill other people, or you don't. And so again, I think we have to apply the same standard here. Terrorism is terrorism, no matter who commits the act. And there has to be in our politics and in our media a recognition that this type of content, this type of ideology gets people killed.
Yeah. One last question on New Zealand. I mean, I think a takeaway for me, for a lot of people who have been watching the story unfold, was a reaction by New Zealand's Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern. She was, engaged, empathetic, really substantive, and just seemed decent. And it was a reminder what a real leader acts like in a crisis. Ben, I think you spent some time with her. What was your impression when you guys have spoken?
I mean, I met with her with Obama. Like a little less than a year ago. And, she's younger than me, Tommy, so it made me feel old. But she reminded me a lot of Justin Trudeau. She's just an incredibly competent, empathetic, and real person. And she was many months pregnant when we met, was, focused on having her baby, but also focused on, how could she create a center-left politics in New Zealand that could be resilient and could be responsive to people, and that could be tolerant and inclusive, but also focused on solving problems. And I think you see in the aftermath of this attack, she's doing things. She's giving very powerful speeches, but she's getting ready to try to crack down on guns, and she's starting a real and necessary effort to root out this type of white supremacist extremism. And so when we talk about how political leadership should respond in the West, I think if you look at what she has done in recent days, if you look at a speech that Justin Trudeau gave in the House of Commons the other day, just categorically rejecting this as the opposite of what our society stand for, that's the type of political leadership that we need to see replicated. And I think in Jacinda Ardern, who's, obviously it's a small country, but it's an example that there is progressive leadership that is unifying and is successful and that can be responsive to people. And so I think people should take note of her because, again, it's a small country, but she's setting a really powerful example. Yeah,
I agree. Changing gears a bit. So a story that you and I have been tracking pretty closely is the ongoing U.S. struggle against Huawei. Huawei, for those unfamiliar, is a Chinese telecommunications giant that has ties to the Chinese military and intelligence services. And so our intelligence agencies worry that if Huawei is allowed to build out communications infrastructure in the U.S. or around the globe, in particular the 5G wireless networks, that it would allow Chinese intelligence to build backdoors into the software that would let them spy on basically anyone using them. So it's a pretty big deal, pretty big security threat. According to the New York Times, the U.S. effort to pressure other countries into rejecting Huawei infrastructure is faltering, including with really close key allies like Germany, which was surprising to me. Do you think that this was inevitable, since a lot of these countries probably, hear our concerns on Huawei and then say we're hypocrites given what they learned about U.S. spying in the Snowden disclosures? Or is this the result of bad diplomacy, some combination? Like, what did you make of that story?
Well, I think there are two elements that are consistent with Trump's broader foreign policy. And this is a really important issue that doesn't necessarily get a lot of attention, but what we're really talking about is how the world's technological supply chain works, and essentially whether or not the U.S. can go around and try to freeze out Chinese technology from other markets. And this affects everything, from the technology you use in your daily lives to, what we rely on for our national security. Mm-hmm. The two problems, though, are, number one, like a lot of things with Trump, including the trade issue with China, he's articulating a goal that is no longer achievable. If you wanted to create a wall between any technology emanating from China and technological supply chains emanating from the United States, you would need a time machine to go back in time, 20 years. And so part of the problem here is as with a lot of things that Trump has demanding that other countries do, whether it's on, trade or other security policies or climate change. These countries, live in a real world, and they're like, look, we can't just cleanse our entire market of technologies that are already embedded into the supply chain. And so, I think it just shows an overreach in terms of the Trump administration's rhetoric going beyond what is possible. But secondly, even if you wanted to try to do that, and even if you did want to try to at least figure out where to draw certain lines, which is probably necessary, well, they've been beating the shit out of these allies for 2 years.
Right.
And it should come as a surprise to nobody that there's a cost to relentlessly insulting these countries and their leaders, and then you go ask them to do something hard, and they say no. Of course they do.
Yeah, you make a Twitter troll the ambassador to Germany. You wonder why they're not going to take your meeting and do what you want when it comes to, intelligence questions.
Yeah, you crap on Angela Merkel. You appoint a troll as your ambassador. You threaten them with tariffs whenever you feel like you need a good rise on Twitter. And then you say, oh, by the way, we need you to change the entire way in which your country uses technology. Well, I guess it shouldn't be a surprise to anybody that that's not going to work.
Last question. Brazil's far-right president, Jair Bolsonaro, is in Washington today to meet with President Trump. He did an interview with Fox News in advance of the meeting and had dinner with Steve Bannon because, of course, Bolsonaro's son is in business with Bannon, so that's weird, too. He is terrible. He is misogynistic. He's anti-immigrant. He's homophobic to the point where he's created a climate that drove a gay lawmaker out of the country because that lawmaker feared for his life. Bolsonaro's family is suspected of being linked to the execution of another British politician. So, that's crazy. Trump brought him to the Oval Office anyway, and they did the press availability after where they continued to hammer on Venezuela, float the idea of a military intervention or a U.S. military base in Brazil. So, my question is, I don't know, what do you do with this guy, given how important the relationship is and the country of Brazil is, but how absolutely terrifying he is? This guy is a fascist. He's a strongman. He's the worst kind of individual to lead a country that's important.
Well, you don't need to roll out the red carpet for him. That's for sure. But Trump seems to be much more comfortable with these people than Angela Merkel or Justin Trudeau or other leaders who are allies. Look, part of what happened in Brazil is that you did have a deep-rooted corruption, disaffection among the public. People turned to this guy. One of the only hardening things is that, by all indications, his popularity in Brazil is plummeting. And you don't need to throw the guy a life raft. And look, it's an important partner, but we can engage the things that we engage Brazil on. We can do without hugging this guy. We have commercial ties. We have cooperation in different fields. Ironically, one of the better areas of cooperation in recent years is on climate change. Mm-hmm. But so there's no need to have this close political relationship with the leader of Brazil to keep that moving forward. And so I'd be keeping somebody like this, a character like this, at arm's length. And on Venezuela, let's just again take a step back. Everything has gotten worse since the Trump administration launched their big play here of recognizing opposition, of more sanctions, of trying to force in aid. So they could bluster all they want, but they haven't put forward a plan B. And some hypothetical military base in Brazil is not the plan B that anybody's looking for at this point.
No, look, we all want Maduro to not be in power and not starving his people. But you're right. They made this big, bold play, and we had all this saber rattling. And, I think it's time to be honest that it hasn't worked. And I think we also need to downgrade General Rubio to Colonel Rubio because, I don't think he's earned those stripes.
Colonel, maybe Sergeant. The fact of the matter is Sergeant Rubio charged up the hill, and nobody's following him on Twitter.
Nope.
Maybe German damn. But I just the issue with this too is that they keep threatening this military option, but nobody has any idea what they're talking about. Have you heard anybody, Tommy, articulate what that even means?
No. The closest I've seen is 5,000 troops to Colombia on a scribbled note on John Bolton's
on a scribbled John Bolton thing, right? I mean, so if they're serious about it, what are they talking about here?
Yeah.
And who's going to support it, and how is it going to work? I worry about it.
Yeah. But I'm with you. Like, I don't mean to be glib about this. I've worried about this and thought about it and tried to do interviews on it for a long time because I don't know what else to do. That's my only thing I could do in this post-White House life. But their plan is not serious, nor is it credible, and it has not been effective. And the fact that we're still focused on, the military discussions and all these options that he floated today with Bolsonaro instead of a real diplomatic effort that unites the world and actually does something diplomatically that would help people. It's problematic. It's not helping.
And that's the point: is are you actually trying to get something done, or is this just kind of a bad posture?
Yeah.
If you actually want to help the Venezuelan people, what they are doing has made things worse. And the military intervention, I think, would make things even worse.
Yeah, agreed.
They are sitting on a easy, no-brainer policy decision to provide protected status for Venezuelans who have come to the United States fleeing this, and they're refusing to do even that, which just shows that this does not seem to be about helping actual Venezuelans. It seems to be about a political agenda of Trump and Private Rubio.
Yeah, agreed. Ben, travel safe. Please grab every student's phone and smash that subscribe button when you find Pod Save the World. Every little stat matters. They all add up. Life is a game of inches. Podcasting is a game of inches, as they say.
I've already met one friend of the pod, Tommy.
All right,
when I was coming to my hotel, who said she heard us talking about this last week.
So, there we go.
I expect to see some friends of the pod tonight. And I've got some more colleges and universities coming up in the spring because my book's coming out in paperback.
Oh, cool.
College kids can afford it. So I'll have more info on that next week.
Fantastic, man. All right, buddy. Great talking to you. See you soon. And that's all I got.
Cool.
All right, bye.
See you soon. Bye.